Um, you call yourself an anarchist or anarcho-syndicalist, to be precise. My question, or actually I would like to pose more questions on this topic. But the first question is very simple, but I guess the answer should be very complex. How would an anarchist society would look like? How would anarchist society would look like? Sorry. And second question: how to communicate anarchist ideas? Because my experience is, and I'm not anarchist myself, but kind of sympathizer. My experience is that people, when you say the word anarchy, people imagine a lack of order. People imagine lack of security, something like the Hobbesian state of nature, the war of all against all, and so on. And I think that the general idea of anarchism in the general public is very much influenced by this misconception. So how to communicate anarchist ideas?
Well, with the first thing to do is to overcome the misconceptions, to explain what you mean by anarchism. Now, it's a pretty broad concept. Like, in general, the concepts of political discourse are very far from precise. I mean, to try to explain what liberal means or capitalism means, or any term you pick, they're used in highly varied and complex and often contradictory ways, and anarchism is no exception. But I think if you try to find a sort of core themes running through anarchist thought and action, there are some. Basically, it seems to me one should think of anarchism as not a specific set of doctrines, but just a kind of a tendency in human thought and action, which tries to detect and discover structures of authority, domination, and hierarchy, and there are plenty of them, and challenge them, ask them to demonstrate their legitimacy, recognizing that they are not self-justifying. They have a burden of justification. That's true all across the spectrum of human life, from patriarchal families to imperial systems and everything in between. Wherever you find a structure of domination, hierarchy, somebody giving orders, somebody taking them, whatever it may be, you have to ask, is that legitimate? You cannot assume that you shouldn't assume it is legitimate because it's been like that. That's not a justification. You have to ask, is it legitimate? When you do, you generally find that it can't be justified. There are cases, you can think of cases where you can make up a justification, but try it. It's pretty hard. Most of the time, the justification is the way power is distributed. That's not a justification. And anarchism is the effort to discover such systems when they can't justify themselves, to dismantle them and to move towards greater freedom, justice, opportunity, individual creativity, cooperative activity, and so on. It's just a tendency in history. And I don't think it's hard to communicate to people. I think they take it for granted if it's brought to their attention. And you see it. For example, take one of the major achievements of the last 50 years in many societies, the United States, many others, I'm sure here, has been women's expansion of women's rights. It's changed enormously. And how did it happen? Well, as soon as the structures of oppression were identified, they kind of disappeared. Which is not instantly, of course. There's resistance, still plenty of resistance. But they power, there's a nice, it's a general truth that power prefers darkness. If it's exposed to the light, it erodes. If people can see it, it erodes. And this happens all through history. Where does it lead? So what would the final goal be? I don't think anyone is smart enough to say that, to say what it would be. This is a constant, ongoing effort to try to expand the realm of justice, freedom, independence, breakdown of authority, and so on. And I don't see that should have any limits. You can think of all kind of concrete cases. So, for example, just think of the forms of authority and domination that exist in our societies. One of the dominant ones is wage labor. If you go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution in England and the United States and other countries, people who were being driven into the industrial system bitterly condemned it. In the United States in the mid-19th century, when the Industrial Revolution was beginning, working people described wage labor as equivalent to slavery. The only difference was that wage labor is supposed to be temporary, whereas slavery is permanent. Actually, that was such a widespread idea that it was a slogan of the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln accepted it. That's when Northern workers went to war in the Civil War. That was one of their slogans. Want to eliminate chattel slavery, literal slavery, and what they called wage slavery. No influence of Marx or European radicalism. This just came straight out of popular understanding, the popular understanding of free, independent people who felt their rights are being taken away by being forced into a system where they have to sell themselves to survive. I mean, they understood. You read they had their own. This is the period of the freest press in American history, maybe any history. There's working class press, what were called factory girls, young women taken from the farms and forced into the textile mills, had their own journals. It's very rich literature. And one of the themes was that if you sell what you produce for a price, like you're an independent crafts person, you make something and you sell it, you're selling what you produced. If you work for a wage, you're selling yourself. You're losing your freedom. You're the only thing that you're selling is yourself. You're losing your freedom, your dignity, your independence, your worth as a person. Well, over the century, over the century and a half, this has kind of been instilled into people's heads, and the intuitive understanding of the absolute injustice of this relationship has been kind of suppressed. But I think it's right below the surface. I don't think it takes much for people to recover the understanding that was second nature a century and a half ago. Maybe some work, but that's the kind of thing that organizers and activists ought to be doing. And that's a kind of oppression and domination that I think should be eliminated. And we know how to do it. It should be eliminated by enterprises that are managed and run by their participants. Not a particularly obscure or even utopian concept that happens in many cases. For example, there's in Spain, Basque Country, it's a huge conglomerate, Mondragon, which is more or less run on these principles, not quite, but something like it. It's owned by the participants. They select their own managers. They don't manage it themselves, and they're under recallable and so on and so forth. That's a step towards overcoming the deep oppression of the wage labor system. In the United States, in the old industrial regions, so-called Rust Belt, where the factories have been abandoned and so on. There's a spontaneous spread of worker-owned and worker-managed enterprises, not huge ones, but pretty substantial ones. In fact, they're now one of the more progressive unions. The United Steelworkers is right now involved in discussions with Mondragon in the Basque Country to try to integrate their activities. These things come very naturally to people. It seems perfectly obvious thing to do, and I don't think there's difficulty in communicating it once people are freed from the oppression that comes from just reflexively adopting the customs and conventions in which you survive. Actually, it's rather similar to the women's movement in this respect. So, for example, if you'd asked my grandmother whether she was oppressed, she wouldn't have understood what you're talking about. That's like asking, does she breathe? If you asked my mother whether she was oppressed, she knew it, and she resented it, but she thought there's nothing you can do about it. My daughters, it's totally different. They won't even bother answering it. Those are changes. Those are changes that have taken place just through exposing power to the sunlight and seeing it evaporate. And I think this can happen in many domains. So what would an anarchist society look like? Well, the final result, I don't expect the final result. Human life is too complicated, but you can see steps towards more freedom, more elimination of illegitimate structures of authority, and where it goes is for people to make their own decisions about.
Hopefully, it would be like you describe it, but I still have a little doubt, and that is, isn't it too demanding? It's easier to be led by an authority. I'm myself a sort of activist, and sometimes I regret it all the time. It's terribly time-consuming. It costs me a lot of energy. The outcome is very uncertain. It's not very rewarding, or not all the time. It's easier to be led by authorities. So isn't the idea too much demanding?
That's basically an argument for slavery. The optimal, the ultimate position in which you don't have to make any decisions at all is if the master just tells you what to do in the morning, you go do it. Wage labor is somewhere in between. It's, my grandmother's oppression was somewhere in between. It's true that freedom creates burdens. You have to make choices and decisions. But a burden isn't really the right word. That makes you a more happier, a person's more alive, has greater opportunities for use of their own independent faculties. You can develop your faculties, you can apply them. It does require choices and takes time, but that's all to the good. And I don't, you teach in a university, right? Well, universities are about as close as exists in the modern world to self-managed societies. Like there is an administrative structure. There's the people who run it, and the state authorities and so on. But deans, we've got to get rid of them. But you go to a university faculty, the actual faculty, say the philosophy department or the chemistry department, pretty much they make their own decisions about what they're going to do, what they're going to work on, when you're going to work, when you're not going to work, who you work with, what courses you teach, and so on and so forth. It's not an anarchist society, but it comes about as close as anything in the modern world. And people choose it and prefer it. It just gives you lots of freedom that you don't have in other professions. That's one of the reasons why people quite commonly will take an academic position instead of working in the business world at a much higher salary, but much less freedom. Freedom itself is a remarkable value.
Just a small remark, there were plenty of doctrines, ideologies, and then regimes which were promising anarchical society or a society where the oppressors are gone, but actually they brought more oppression and more suffering, and you can go far back in the history. So,
which do you have in mind?
Well, French Revolution, for instance.
Well, the French Revolution didn't promise anarchy.
Well, that's true. They didn't promise anarchy, but they brought a society in anarchy for a while, and a number of people suffered.
Not anarchy. They brought they did overthrow a system of oppression, like the king, the nobility, the church, and a lot of that was permanent. But it quickly instituted a system of extreme oppression, very quickly. Nevertheless, there were gains, and the gains are permanent. You know, through the rest of French and, in fact, world history, a lot was built on the basis of the achievements that were made, even though they were beaten back.
Well, we have some uglier examples, like the Soviet regime, which was promising. I'm not saying that it was an anarchy, but it was promising something better.
I think that's a mistake. If you take a look back to the early part of the 20th century, early 1900s, the Marxist left was bitterly condemning Lenin because of his authoritarian tendencies. In fact, even people like Trotsky, who later cooperated with him, were pointing out that Lenin's conception, this is before the 1905 revolution even, Lenin's conception was that the Communist Party should rule over the proletariat, the Central Committee should rule over the Communist Party, and the maximal leader, Lenin, should rule over the Central Committee. And in fact, about as soon as the Bolshevik takeover took place in October 1917, that's exactly what happened. If you take a look at I think the history is, in my view, misunderstood. There was a period from April 1917 until October 1917, right in that period. If you read Lenin's writings there, they do have a kind of a libertarian, anarchist flavor. But it was not true before, and it certainly wasn't true after. And I think a kind of cynical but probably accurate interpretation of this is that he was a politician. He was trying to appeal to the revolutionary fervor of the 1917 revolution. So he was taking the positions and the attitudes of the general public and was trying to present himself as the spokesman for them. Once he took power, it was back to the earlier positions, highly authoritarian. And in fact, Lenin, you know, in his justification, he had a reason. He had there was a justification for it. It wasn't just personal power. I mean, he was an orthodox Marxist, and there was a kind of a Marxist orthodoxy, which Marx didn't believe in. But Marx and Marxism are two different things. There was a Marxist orthodoxy, which held that the proletariat has to be the leading force in bringing about a communist revolution. Now, Lenin understood that in Russia was a backward, mostly peasant society. There wasn't a proletariat which could be a leading force. And if you look at Lenin's view at the time, it was that the revolution would take place in Germany, the most advanced industrial society, and Russia would be a kind of a backwater, and it would sort of have to be drawn along in the world revolution. Well, there was a kind of an effort, the Spartacist uprising in 1919, which quickly crushed, and that was the end of Germany as the leading force in the global revolution he was thinking about, and Lenin immediately undertook kind of state capitalist policies, new economic policy. And the idea was to drive Russia, which from his point of view is a backward peasant society, to drive it to industrialization. And then when you get an industrial proletariat, iron laws of history and all that, they'll carry out the revolution. Marx, incidentally, didn't believe that. And Marx himself was quite impressed by the revolutionary potential of the Russian peasantry. He was, in his last years, you look at his manuscripts, he was spending a lot of time on the detailed analyses that were presented by the Narodniks of the Russian peasantry, and he was pretty impressed by them and felt that there was a real revolutionary potential there. But that was not the view of the urban Marxists, either the Bolsheviks or the Social Democrats. And they kind of suppressed that work of his. It wasn't really discovered until considerably later. But I think that was kind of the logic of it. So there was never an effort, in my view, in the part of this is not the Soviet Union, this is Russia, to have it lead a socialist, communist, even socialist revolution. I think that's a misunderstanding. Of course, that was the world's two propaganda systems insist that the Soviet Union was socialist. The West insists on it in order to undermine socialism. The East insisted on it to try to gain what they could from the moral appeal of socialism. And when the world's two propaganda systems, the huge one in the West and the small one in the East, when they agree on something, it tends to be kind of persuasive. But I think it's just flat wrong on both cases and kind of opportunistic in both sides.